Okay, so Chris contacted me to basically to chat about the Arms Trade Treaty, and in particular, how things, what happened during the July diplomatic conference in this past year, and then sort of the prospects for the future of the treaty in this next year. So I thought I would first of all start with a little bit of the history of the Arms Trade Treaty, then talk about the July conference, and then kind of finally talk about what next. So first, under the history, many of you may know this already, but the Arms Trade Treaty was in my view, another situation where civil society has played a significant role in both promoting and politically getting states on side to put together an arms trade treaty at the UN. The reason we did this, a lot of it is kind of summarized in this particular publication, which is now almost a decade old, I just realized, called Shattered Lives. It was one of the first publications of the Control Arms campaign, which is a civil society campaign that's been promoting an arms trade treaty. And it kind of lays out the main reasons why an ATT is needed. And a lot of it, of course, is based on humanitarian concerns about the impacts of both proliferation and misuse of weapons. What we recognize is that although there are controls on the arms trade, the majority of them are at the national level. There are some regional agreements that affect arms transfers, but there's certainly nothing at the global level. There's no accepted global standards on the trade in conventional weapons. And as a consequence of that, of course, there's a range of standards and even what states would claim to be legal transfers. All states are agreed that there's a problem around illegal trade in arms, illicit transfers, and that was the source of the UN Program of Action on Small Arms agreed to in 2001. It was the illicit trade in small arms that was identified as a problem, and the Program of Action was kind of the main agreed political solution at the global level. But there's a whole area of trade that we would call irresponsible arms trade that isn't necessarily illegal. It conforms in some cases to national standards and legal requirements, but does result in human rights violations, in problems around corruption, impacts on development, and even occasionally in as we're seeing in Syria at the moment, international humanitarian law breaches where we've got war crimes and other things going on that are not directly responsible arising from arms transfers, but certainly where arms are a major factor. So it was out of the civil society concern about the humanitarian impacts of arms flows that there was first at the civil society level the political impetus to call for an international treaty on arms trade. At the same time, one of the things that all the groups involved in this process have recognized is this is one tool in dealing with arms flows and in dealing with the impact on individuals and communities of conventional weapons. We recognize that there are complexities to the issue that even in terms of looking at it from a supply and demand perspective, the ATT is simply a supply tool within potentially other tools that deal with supply. And then on the demand side, there's a whole raft of issues and concerns that have to be addressed on why do people pick up weapons in the first place. And that's quite separate from anything that the ATT can address. In terms of how this all started from the civil society side, initially it arose out of work or a proposal by the Nobel Peace Laureates, led by Oscar Arias of Costa Rica, in 1997, where they proposed the idea of a code of conduct on arms transfers. This was at a time when there was interest in both the U.S. and Europe in the code of conduct process. Eventually in Europe it led to the European Union Code of Conduct on arms exports, which eventually became the European Union Common Position on arms exports, which is now legally binding on European states. There was similar work done in the U.S. in the 1990s, but obviously did not get nearly as far. There was some proposals around legislation, but they didn't, in the end, unfortunately, get to the same, picked up in the same way that did in the EU. But it did mean that civil society was kind of prompted by this call to look at a global instrument. And it was in 1999 that the first groupings of civil society came together to propose the idea of a campaign, or at least in those early years, some effort to promote the code of conduct idea, and then what eventually became a framework convention, as it was called at that time. But it was in 2003 that the Controlled Arms Campaign actually began. And some of you may recall that at that time, the main instrument for moving the campaign forward was a photo petition. We aimed to get 1 million faces to support the idea of a arms trade treaty. And it's hard to believe, but this was, even though it was 2003, this was the days before any kind of social networking tools were available. So this was done literally by taking pictures of people and sending them by email and compiling them. And eventually we did get the 1 million faces that we called for, and a petition was presented to the UN Secretary General in July of 2006 with all those 1 million faces kind of symbolized. We weren't actually literally able to give them all the pictures, but we did have them. And it was, in my view, no coincidence that the UN process itself began with the first resolution called Towards an Arms Trade Treaty in December 2006 that was voted on and overwhelmingly supported by the General Assembly at the UN. And that kicked off the arms trade treaty process within the UN system. It went through the various steps that typically happen at the UN. First, there was a call for submissions from individual member states to the Secretary General on feasibility, scope, and parameters of what a treaty might look like, or feasibility, of course, whether the treaty makes sense at all. Those were all gathered in 2007. Then we went into a group of governmental experts looking at the issue in 2008. Then the open-ended working group process that was originally planned for 2 years, 2009, 2010. Fortunately, it was recognized after 1 year of the open-ended working group that the next year was going to look a lot like the first year, so some of the states actually were, led by the UK, were keen to move to the next stage, which was actually to begin negotiations. And in December of 2009, the next major resolution adopted by the General Assembly agreed to negotiations beginning with preparatory committee meetings in 2010 and leading to the diplomatic conference in July of 2012, just a few months ago. Another reason I think that things moved forward was that in December 2009, that was the first time that the U.S. came on board with the process. Prior to that, under the Bush administration, there had been nothing basically but opposition to the idea from the U.S. But with the new Obama administration in 2009, they agreed that they would also support an arms trade treaty. The one condition that they imposed on that was that during negotiations in July, the agreement would be by consensus. And I'll come back to that a little later. So from the UN, I mean, in spite of the fact that we started in 2003, going to a conference almost 10 years later, 2012, and actually got a UN process going from early December or early 2007 to 2012, 5 years. For most people, I think that would seem like an awful long time to be, moving things forward. But and those of you here probably know this better than I. But our understanding is from the typical UN process that was actually very quick. And so we do now have a treaty conference that occurred in this year. Although this, I would claim that this was initially promoted by civil society, it was obviously necessary to have a number of states within the UN system, UN member states, supportive of the process and actually leading in the UN on the process. And we did have that in at least the co-authors of the resolution. There's 6 states, the UK, Australia, Finland, Japan, Costa Rica, and Kenya. All through the process, they've been kind of lead states for making sure that all the resolutions are in place and so on. And in addition to those, we've had Norway, Mexico, and New Zealand primarily as what we would call progressive states that have been working closely with civil society in promoting the idea of a strong arms trade treaty with elements that make it effective, and that where resistance is needed at times to proposals that we would view as weakening the treaty. A number of these states have been very good at pushing back. So all of that's kind of preliminary to the fact that we did have the all-important negotiation conference in July of this year for 4 weeks. As I mentioned in this article, it could, at first blush, it could be viewed as a failure because it didn't result in a treaty. There was no agreement at the end of the 4 weeks. But I think, in fact, we now view it as a significant step, and one that certainly at the time there was a strong sense that we were very close to having something that we could claim as a victory. We recognize in kind of in the light of the day, I guess, that there's still a fair bit of work to be done in some aspects of the treaty, but by and large, it's in good shape, and that's well, maybe what I'll mention first is why it ended in failure before I get to why we think it actually can be viewed at least as a partial success. First, in the early part of the negotiations, there was a lot of procedural wrangling around the status of Palestine and the Holy See that took 4 days to sort out. So almost, a quarter of the negotiation time was lost to procedural wrangling. And some of that was long-standing concerns, particularly around Palestine. Some of it was clearly meant to delay things and to waste time. And that we've had all the way through the process from what we call the skeptical states. They've taken advantage of all occasions to try and either delay things or weaken text or do whatever they can to essentially prevent the treaty. There was the problem of consensus as probably in many ways the largest problem of the whole process in July. Because the understanding was that we had to have a text where there was full agreement, and there's different definitions of what that means. But basically the understanding was, at least from what we were told, that consensus would be if no one objected. If essentially either state said yay or didn't say anything at all. But if there were any major objections, then consensus would fall apart. There was an expectation, particularly as we got closer to the end of the process of the negotiations, that political pressure would be brought to bear on some of the skeptical states so that they would at least stay silent. And that's why on the penultimate day, the Thursday, we had a draft text that looked close enough to what we needed, and there was indication that many of the states that were skeptical would stay quiet. There was strong expectation that we would actually be able to deliver a treaty after a long day on the Friday, dealing with some of the final pieces. What ended the things very quickly on the Friday was the U.S. announcement that there hadn't been enough time, and that they were calling for more time. U.S. rightly got a lot of blame for that because they had been part of the negotiation process and they played a core role. We know they worked with the chair on a lot of the text. We know that that the drafts that the chair presented had been looked at by the U.S. and there was opportunities for them to have input into that. And although we knew that they still had some problems with the Thursday text, again, the expectation was that those problems could be sorted out on the Friday. So the U.S. was blamed. Again, in retrospect, they likely were not the only ones that would have created problems on the Friday. Russia was very quick to also say we needed more time after the U.S. Made its announcement. Other states and the skeptical states, just to give you some ideas of who they were, Egypt, North Korea, Syria, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, all through the 4 weeks had been very verbal in opposition to many aspects of the treaty. So it is quite possible that they hid behind the U.S. decision, that if the U.S. hadn't made that announcement, one of those states or one or more of those states would also have essentially blocked consensus. The chair, through the process, knew that it was going to be a very hard road to hoe, that to get a consensus agreement he was going to have to do a lot of behind-the-scenes work, which he did. And that in itself created problems. There were a number of committee and informal meetings that went on during the negotiations that were clearly designed to occupy the skeptics, to keep them involved and in some ways away from the real discussions that were clearly happening kind of behind the scenes. But at the same time, they excluded a lot of the supporters of the treaty, and they felt like they were left out of the negotiations. In particular, a lot of African states and a lot of other non-English speaking states, because all of the informal meetings were conducted solely in English because of their nature. The idea was to get out of the main room into a smaller room where essentially only one or two members of the delegation could literally fit into the room, and then to really hammer out the details of some of the more difficult parts of the treaty. That became a very frustrating process for a lot of states because English, there was no translation or interpretation available. English wasn't necessarily their strength, so they felt like they were missing things. And it was really only the main players that were engaged at that point because of literally the size of the room and the amount of time that was available. So that left a bit of a bitter taste even among some of the supporter states. That said, the final draft text, as I mentioned, many felt that it was very close to what we could accept as a good treaty. It did have some very important provisions that certainly civil society had been pushing for in many of the progressive states. It does contain a national risk assessment process, for example, where states would be obligated to go through assessing whether, on basically a case-by-case basis, whether a proposed transfer would create problems for international human rights, for international humanitarian law, impacts on development, a number of different criteria. That is in the text. So there is that assessment process, which is crucial. It does also put at the core of the treaty adherence to international law. So, particularly international human rights law, international humanitarian law, are recognized as important at the level of if there's right now, I think it's an overriding risk that those laws would be breached, the transfer must not go forward. It must be prevented. There is a problem with the word overriding. Our preference is for substantial risk rather than overriding, but that's something where there's some interpretation as to how to get around that. It does have within the scope of the treaty small arms and light weapons, which is absolutely essential for many of the states that, like in Africa, that are supporting the treaty. The reason they support it is that they see it as a tool to deal with the problem of small arms in their states. That is now in the treaty. So there are some important core elements that are there in the draft. There are a number of areas where work needs to be done. I can maybe return to those in questions or a little later. But I think what I want to move on to now is just, where do we go from here now that we didn't reach the treaty in July as anticipated. Well, actually just last week, the first committee at the UN passed a resolution, the latest resolution on the Arms Trade Treaty, that approved essentially an extension of the diplomatic conference that occurred in July in March of next year for 2 weeks. It'll also operate under consensus. That's the rules of procedure will again be that the agreement has to be reached by consensus. That was for a number of civil society groups, that was viewed to be a major mistake, and we pushed back very strongly on that during the first committee process at the UN. We didn't succeed, but what we did manage to achieve was, based on procedures and resolutions that have been put in place for the one of the nuclear treaties. Sorry, I've forgotten which one. I'll have to check on that. But there had been a precedent for ensuring that if there was a failure to reach agreement under consensus, there was a fallback process to take things to the General Assembly and go through normal or typical UN rules of procedure, which is eventually a vote as necessary. You try for consensus. If you don't achieve it, you go to a vote. That is now written into the resolution, so there is, if things fail in March, we know immediately we can move on to a General Assembly voting procedure. And that, the way it's worded is, it can be interpreted as it would all be wrapped up by the end of 2013. So by this time next year, effectively. There are, however, challenges beyond that. In March, we won't have the same chair as in the conference that happened in July. Ambassador Moretan of Argentina had led the process right from December 2006 all the way through. He had been key to a lot of the work behind the scenes as well as the work that took place in a formal context. He's not going to be there in March, and it's not entirely clear who will be at this point, so that poses a challenge. We still have the skeptical states. They're still going to be attempting to block things. We know there's going to be opposition to some of the amendments that we want to see in the treaty, in the current text, to strengthen it. We know that there's going to be what I call parochial interests of particular states, India being one example, where there is a clause in the treaty that addresses specifically their concerns around what are being called defense cooperation agreements. And it's a very problematic clause, but it was kind of India's condition for coming on board. Another problem, in my view, is Canada and its parochial interests around firearms and impacts on legitimate firearms owners, which is basically the only thing that they are raising in this context at the moment. They want preamble language, and if they don't get it, they might be a problem. And then the U.S. will be a special case regardless. They have concerns around ammunition. Initially, they didn't want it in the treaty at all. There's now been some compromises, but they're weak, and we'll have to see where that discussion goes. That said, there is still a lot of support for completing a strong treaty. We've got now the first committee resolution with the follow-up mechanism. We know that there will be opportunities for certainly civil society to meet with the chair in advance, for us to have hopefully some influence, but certainly at least opportunity to speak with the new chair. We know that the majority of states supports a strong treaty, so that they will be pushing back on the skeptics. And we're looking at some preliminary meetings in advance of March to help bring together states that want to see a strong text to the point where potentially they could agree to what the text is that they want to see out of March in advance, so that potentially that text could be taken to the next stage. Where do I think things are going to go at this point? Interestingly, during the first committee, even the states that were the strongest for arguing that consensus was necessary in the March meeting, which were basically the states that said if we don't have consensus, the U.S. won't be on board, and we need the U.S. All of them were, how to put it politely. None of
it's a privileged platform. There's so many people like
yeah. None of them thought that it would be successful. They all thought March would also end in failure because of the consensus rule. The irony here was here were these states who were voting for consensus in the resolution as being, crucial to and core to the resolution, unwilling to hear our view that the consensus shouldn't be there, but at the same time saying that we know it's not going to work. Which is why I think in the end we were able to get the additional clause put in the resolution that has the fallback, because originally that wasn't there, and that was a civil society suggestion. So we do have essentially coming out of March immediately triggering a General Assembly process that will vote on a treaty by the end of 2013. And then just to touch on the Canadian situation and what Canada will be doing, I mean, my sense is that Canada will continue to play a very minor role in the Arms Trade Treaty process, except potentially a disruptive one if they feel that they have to press on protecting the rights of hunters and shooters and so on. So I think I'll just leave it at that for now and see if comments or questions.